Welcome to Big Closet, Small Planet, and this special episode as part of a series for Climate Action Week as part of the Scandinavian Textile Initiative for Climate Action. In this episode, we have two special guests who I would say represent another important part of the change system, representing two organizations. We'll see if they define themselves as NGOs or watchdogs, who are in the process of holding brands, retailers, and other stakeholders accountable for their climate action. And so we're going to hear a little bit about what their organizations are hoping and requiring and demanding from the industry and from specific companies. We have both Ruth and Liv here today, and I think it's best if they introduce themselves and their organizations instead of me. So, Ruth, let's start with you.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Ruth MacGilp. I am based in Edinburgh in the UK, and I'm a campaign manager at Action Speaks Louder, which I'll refer to as ASL. I work specifically on the apparel and textiles sector, and I've been working closely with Fashion Revolution on the What Fuels Fashion project, which I'm sure we'll discuss later. And ASL is a non-profit organisation or NGO based in Australia with team members mostly working in Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, as well as Europe. And ASL's goal is to accelerate the global transition from fossil fuels to solar and wind. And this is by pushing influential companies and sectors to invest in decarbonisation through research, through campaigns, advocacy that, as you said, holds them accountable, in this case, for the climate claims and promises that they're already making. And we work on textiles as just one of several sectors, including tech, auto, steel, because of its relatively high climate impact and supply chain footprint and political influence, as well as its opportunity to invest in renewable energy. So looking forward to getting into this.
Brilliant. And just for the purposes of understanding how you are funded, do you get grants through foundations, or how do you manage to support your work?
So ASL is funded solely by philanthropic grants from various charitable foundations. So we don't accept money from governments or companies or individual donations either.
Brilliant. And Liv, how about Fashion Revolution?
Hello, Michael. Really pleased to be here today with Ruth and yourself. So, as a bit of an introduction, my name is Liv Simpliciano, and I am based just outside of London. I am the Policy and Research Manager at Fashion Revolution, which is the world's largest fashion activism movement. Over the last decade, we've been advocating for a fairer, more transparent, and sustainable fashion industry through our three-pillared strategy of cultural change, industry change, and policy change. Our movement spans around 80 countries, and each year we mobilize millions of citizens through our campaigns, social media channels, and online and offline events. In terms of my work specifically, over the last 4 years, I've led work on research assessing major fashion brands and retailers' level of transparency, otherwise referred to as public disclosure, across a range of human rights and environmental issues. More recently, Fashion Revolution is placing a spotlight on climate, just transition, and energy-related public disclosure, which is our What Fuels Fashion work, which Ruth mentioned, and we'll get into further detail in a little while. So in terms of how Fashion Revolution is funded, we have several nonprofit partners and philanthropic donors, including individual contributors who donate occasionally or regularly through our website. And some of our current funders include the Lades Foundation, the Tara Climate Foundation, the Pooled Fund on International Energy, and more. And in the past, we've also received some funding from the European Union, the British Council, among others.
Perfect. So let me ask you to give me a quick assessment, both of you. On a scale of 1 to 5, from your perspective, with 5 being the apparel industry is doing great in terms of its decarbonization work. It's making a lot of headway. It's moving at the pace and scale it needs. And number one, it's a catastrophe. The industry is not doing at all what it needs. It's going backwards. How would you both, based on what you know and your analysis, rate the industry today? Let's start with Ruth.
That's a very hard question. I think I'd say 2, because I think one is, we've gone through this journey over the past couple of decades of brands setting targets and hiring sustainability managers and kind of doing that bare minimum stuff. And we're moving more into the implementation phase now, but we're still nowhere near 5 because emissions are going up. We still have a huge amount of work to do.
And Liv.
I think Ruth and I are pretty aligned in how we'd respond, because I myself was thinking around a 2. And building off of what Ruth has shared, I feel like I would ground that rating in the impacts of the most vulnerable workers in the supply chain and what we've been hearing from suppliers. I think, building again off of what Ruth has shared, like the research is there. We know what the problems are. They're very much well defined. So this really is about implementation, and that implementation sits alongside a very critical lifeline, a very critical timeline ahead of us to address and mitigate for the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So I would definitely give it a 2, being led by the lived experience of workers in the supply chain and some of the barriers and issues that we're hearing from the supplier perspective. So I would very much, say 2.
Okay. So let me ask you about, if 2 is, which on a scale of 1 to 5 is not very good, what does then success look like when it comes to this for your organizations, when it comes to climate action? What would make it a 5 or a 4.5?
Success for Fashion Revolution means increased transparency from major fashion brands across all the areas we assess. Our theory of change as an organization is rooted in the belief that greater transparency enables public scrutiny and accountability, which can drive the systemic change we're ultimately campaigning for. In reference again to my 2 rating, there's a huge lack of transparency still in the industry. The problems are well defined. In order to address those problems, we need reliable, transparent public disclosure to help address those problems. So in terms of our theory of change, bringing it back to that, a key part of our impact as an organization in terms of our success lies in citizen empowerment and in how civil society partners use our data to hold brands to account, especially by verifying on the ground realities against what companies publicly claim. So, for example, Clean Clothes campaign uses our data on brands' living wage disclosures to assess the gap between corporate commitments and the reality reflected in workers' actual wage slips. We've also heard directly from brands we evaluate that our research really helps them identify blind spots and refine their sustainability strategies. So beyond the industry, success really looks like policymakers using our data to support the case for stronger regulation. And I think, again, bringing it back to that rating of 2, I think it's important that we acknowledge that, the work that Fashion Revolution does and other organizations like Ruth's, which she'll share more in depth in just a moment, we are kind of dissatisfied at the level of kind of bare minimum transparency that we're seeing in the industry, because, as I already mentioned, availability of that data, that progress data, kind of the lay of the land of where brands are at, all of that transparency is super important and kind of the baseline in which we need to address the really crucial human rights and environmental issues that we're facing as an industry.
Oh, well, now you got me very interested in wondering if you think legislation is going to make any difference in helping you achieve your goal. But we'll come back to that, I promise. Okay, and Ruth, what about your organization?
Yeah, again, dissatisfaction is a good word for the current state of affairs. I suppose success for us more specifically is measured by tangible growth in renewable energy globally. And that's, led by science, the climate science recommendations that we need to triple renewable energy capacity globally in order to meet the demands of the Paris Agreement. And this is, I guess, ultimately because despite this massive surge in corporate sustainability over the past 10 years or so, the Earth, really can't tell the difference unless fossil fuels are actively being displaced. So that needs to be translated to real dollars spent, real megawatt hours generated, and real emissions reductions in absolute terms. So right now, the fashion sector is lagging behind on all of that. It's lagging behind on transitioning to renewables where it counts most in the supply chain. But I do think there are a lot of untapped opportunities. So I suppose our organization exists apart to play a role in unlocking some of those opportunities as well.
I'm thinking about how your organizations work together just to understand if Fashion Revolution is about the transparency piece, and tell me if I'm wrong, Liv, and Action Speaks Louder is particularly focused on the transition to renewable energy. Is it simply you're working together because your data from Fashion Revolution helps Action Speaks Louder and vice versa? Is there anything there in terms of how you complement each other that's important to know?
I think to answer the question, perhaps we'll first kind of share what our kind of methods and what action looks like for us. And then once we each share, perhaps we can talk more specifically about how we work together, just to give an overview. So in terms of Fashion Revolution and how we operate in like an advocacy sense, we prioritize system levels change rather than focusing on individual brands. We look at issues industry wide. We position ourselves both within and outside the industry, advocating for systemic change across the entire ecosystem, regardless of market segment. So our focus is on driving progress through constructive engagement. And our research serves as a key tool in this approach, as it enables us to work collaboratively with participating brands, encouraging them to improve and aligning them with best practices. So through this approach, we aim to create pressure and momentum for change from within, while remaining grounded in the demands of citizens, workers, and civil society. So we're very much within and outside of the industry and take a systems level approach rather than focusing on individual brands. But I'll pass on to Ruth to share a bit more about their approach.
Sure. So, yeah, I suppose I look at it as for a major company to make a major change, we need a whole bunch of different approaches. We need carrots and sticks. So we need the combined efforts of different organizations, some of which are more focused on gathering the data, convening the industry, the research, the policy advocacy, as well as what we do, which is more of the kind of targeted campaigns, the external pressure upon companies. Ultimately, we are working towards the same goal. And yeah, I'll just add that the reason we work together on this project specifically is because of the huge amount of data that Fashion Revolution collect every single year on brands' public disclosures, which is completely, invaluable to the work of other civil society organizations, as they've mentioned, as well as us. So we use that data and we feed in on, the different indicators that are used to collect that data. So again, we work together because it requires both sides, the data, the transparency, but also the kind of implementation and the action on the ground, as I spoke about.
Sorry, if I may, I'll just add another detail in terms of how we work together. So it's not just how the data is utilized, but it's also how, what are the indicators or asks of brands within our methodology. So we build that methodology in consultation with pro bono, like technical experts, one of which is Ruth. So it's a collaborative, collective process with other kind of industry experts and civil society orgs and so on to really kind of collate what is best practice, and translate that into a methodology full of indicators. And that really informs the data that we're collecting. So we hope that we're crafting the project for outcomes that will be useful to help leverage the demands of our civil society partners.
Right. And I'm getting a little stuck on how you work and your role in the system. I hope that's okay. But because then I need to get into specifically what you're asking for, and more beyond more generally. But I know that there's lots of other platforms that are not, I guess, accountability watchdog sort of angled in the same way of your organizations are. I'm thinking of both the membership organizations like Cascal, and I'm thinking of the Fashion Pact and the Fashion Charter. And I know from my own experience that they have their strengths and weaknesses. I remember, Ruth, there was a presentation I think you gave for the OECD where you mentioned that these kinds of organizations, although they may have their benefits, they can often act sort of as a safe harbor for inaction, so to speak. Can you say a little bit more about that, and then maybe how you see your role in relation to that?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for watching that presentation. Yeah, I mean, kind of, there's a broad spectrum of multi-stakeholder organizations within sustainable fashion, um, or fashion more generally. But I suppose one of the critiques that I have is that as these initiatives get bigger, and particularly in membership initiatives that they're focused on growing membership numbers, it can be difficult to maintain high standards. It's a careful balancing act to keep companies engaged without scaring them off with too much ambition. I think there's a really good example recently of B Corp, receiving criticism around its methodology and then revising it, to strengthen it because of the focus on growing membership. So the criticism with multi-stakeholder initiatives is really that the format can enable loopholes, that brands are not necessarily having to meet as stringent as requirements as perhaps would be the aspiration of the multi-stakeholder initiative. And this isn't to target one specific organization. You've listed a few there. There's lots of industry collectives. But as you also said, that they can have huge positives, and they are conveners of the industry. And unlike perhaps an external watchdog, as you call it, they have the power to get the right people in the room, and they can be really good levers for change when they do hold companies to those higher standards. So actually a lot of our work as the so-called watchdog is to engage with these groups, raise issues that could be so much more impactful when they're being addressed by multiple brands at once rather than just one at a time. But in terms of our role in that ecosystem, it's really to apply pressure where needed, to provide inspiration, I suppose, lift up best practices, and to engage people in holding those brands or those organizations accountable.
So let us jump to what you're specifically, as organizations, asking from the industry or from particular segments of the industry. What is it that you want the industry or individual companies to do when it comes to climate action that they're not doing?
To answer this question, I think it would be useful to outline some of the indicators within our What Fuels Fashion methodology for this year, as this really informs our asks of brands. So with this edition of the report, we're looking, or rather making the statement that brands must support the transition away from burning fossil fuels like coal, both on-site and off-site, and towards electrification powered by renewable energy. Our asks are directly in line with the climate science, and ultimately the end goal, globally and across industries, is a fully electric, fully renewable industry by 2040, including all energy sources. So again, to highlight the climate science here, so we're kind of on the same page. Industries must phase out coal in the 2030s, transition to 100% clean electricity by 2040, and electrify heat-intensive processes in manufacturing, such as dyeing, drying, and finishing. So recognizing this, it's really crucial that brands push for a fully renewable supply chain by 2040 to help accelerate clean energy adoption in key manufacturing hubs. So, that being said, our methodology for our research this year really seeks to raise brands' ambition levels in line with the climate science. In terms of like our asks of brands, like the methodology itself is more granular this year across a few key areas, including coal phase out. So whereas last year we asked only if brands had a time-bound and measurable coal phase out target, this year we're looking for greater disclosure on the scope of those targets. So we need visibility and to know the scope of their targets to ensure that brands are addressing all forms of coal dependence, both on-site and off-site, across all supply chain tiers. So to give an example for the listeners, if a brand's coal phase out target only covers direct emissions, so coal burned at their supplier facilities, but not purchased steam, the factories may still be indirectly relying on coal for heating processes. So if brands commit to phasing out purchased steam from fossil fuels, it helps incentivize suppliers to invest in things like electric boilers powered by renewable energy, heat pumps for industrial processes, or perhaps waste heat recovery to improve efficiency. I know I've said a lot, but just the last thing to kind of round out before I pass on to Ruth is that the other area we're putting greater spotlight and emphasis on, again, is financing. This is super important. And to really zoom out, we are already starting from a place of injustice in the fashion industry. Those that contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions are on the sharpest end of climate change impacts, including within garment producing countries and garment workers. So we need to understand that major fashion brands that contribute the most towards the industry's emissions need to bear the greatest financial responsibility for the industry's transition to renewable energy. So this year, we're specifically measuring transparency on brands' CAPEX, their capital expenditure, so investment and financial support provided to their suppliers to help meet the brand's decarbonization targets, like investment in decarbonization technologies and energy efficiency solutions, as well as OPEX, so operational expenses, so how they're supporting suppliers with increased operational expenses from using these new technologies. And then finally, looking for transparency on brands' CAPEX specifically for climate adaptation. So if they're being transparent about investments in installing climate adaptation solutions like air conditioning or cooling systems to help mitigate heat stress. So this is, some of the core things that we're assessing and looking for transparency on that will inform the reports, our key messages, and how we will kind of campaign on this research. But
I have a lot of questions. I have so many questions, but I don't want to get lost before Ruth gets to chime in, because I think some of these questions may overlap for both of you. So I think that was very clear, at least to me. Ruth, what are you asking if it's different from Fashion Revolution?
So we're very aligned on these asks. We've developed them in collaboration. We're also asking brands to commit to phasing out fossil fuels and investing in electrification powered by renewable energy. And I suppose while Fashion Revolution is measuring what the brands are disclosing, and that may be an incentive for them to disclose, we're also, asking individual brands about more granular evidence for those things. So, the organization is called Actions Speak Louder Than Words. So we want brands to be setting targets and making commitments, but ultimately we want to see evidence. So when Liv talks about the financing, for example, we want to see tangible evidence of, for example, a brand investing in a heat pump pilot project, or supporting one of its suppliers to get a PPA or solar panels installed. These actual tangible examples of impact, ways that suppliers can access finance, and how they're ensuring that decarbonization process is happening in the most impactful way, so through high quality renewable energy. So I don't have too much to add to Liv's answer. I think there's a huge amount of detail in the report that people can explore if they're interested.
Okay, so a few questions. I'm thinking about sort of the ideal ask versus feasibility given infrastructure and geography. Uh, there's been a lot of discussion from some supply chain actors in all sorts of tiers, as they're often labeled, to say, asking us to do certain things is unrealistic because in our country, region, geography, we do not have access to this type of renewable energy or these types of solutions, or we've already, as a company, done all we can. And so if you're asking brands to do that, is there some sort of nuanced approach that you have to say, as long as a buyer or brand reduces their emissions according to a science-based target or such at a pace, right, a science-based target, so we know 2030 goals, 2040 goals, how they get to that is flexible for you all, or do you have a certain prescribed way that they have to do that?
Yeah, so speaking from Action Speaks Louder, we do a huge amount of research that's geographically contextual when we're talking to brands. So we know that depending on their supply chain footprint, that progress is going to look very different. In terms of general feasibility from a supplier's point of view, we also regularly talk to the suppliers about what the challenges and the barriers are that they're facing, and use that to tailor our approach to what we're asking brands for. So if a brand is sourcing, from India, from Turkey, from countries with PPAs, the pace of change might be a bit faster. In more challenging locations like Bangladesh, electrification and renewable energy still faces a lot of barriers. So we definitely take that into account. We understand the perspective of brands saying that there's challenges. At the same time, there is a huge amount of low-hanging fruit that brands are not yet doing, some of which can even, not only be politically feasible in the current policy frameworks, but also even save money. And I mean, we might go into detail more on this later, but we ask brands to provide the finance and relevant technical support for suppliers, but also to help them advocate within their countries for policy frameworks that will help accelerate that access to renewable energy. I can leave it there if we're going to go into that in later questions.
We can go into that. Liv, did you have any reflections on this particular question?
I think, building off what Ruth has shared, I would add that in terms of Fashion Revolution's research and our messaging, we very much recognize, it's a fact that reaching net zero and reducing emissions is not a cost neutral activity. It's going to require a tremendous amount of funding. But I think in terms of, achieving these climate transition plans related, looking at individual brand plans aside, what's really important is to have long-term, stable purchasing practices, like to practice fair purchasing practices and to really address the power imbalances in the industry. So looking at specific brand by brand plans, like looking at that aside, I think echoing our messaging, it's really important that brands do not just chop and change their suppliers, that they're really invested and helping them achieve, the brand level climate transition plans and supporting their suppliers in this process. Like, what we don't want to see is fashion brands abandoning suppliers where the context is difficult, because, the supply chain and the global fashion industry as it operates today is working exactly as it was designed. We need brands to be really invested and treating their suppliers and supply chain, workers as, genuine, treating them more than just vendors, being committed to them and their livelihoods as people.
And I think there's a long conversation perhaps to be had there about, are all, what you say, suppliers equal? My experience is that there are some tier 1, tier 2 vertical who are very successful, very large, very financially successful, and then there's those others that are not, or have less margins, or less long term, I would say, security. Do you think is there a one size fits all approach to how you see this, or should there be, again, and Ruth, maybe you would mention this, there's some sort of nuance into how we talk about supply chain partners and the relationship between buyers?
I mean, I would just say definitely there's not a one size fits all approach. And when we're talking about just transition, it's really about building climate transition plans from a place of consultation and dialogue with the people that are going to be implementing it. Because, as you said, there's a huge amount of variation geographically, even in the same industrial zone in a specific city. So that's where the level of detail that this report and others are asking for is so necessary. How did they come up with these targets, and how are they implementing them? And I think there are kind of blanket things that every brand should have in terms of fair purchasing practice policies, high quality procurement policies and such. We totally agree that it's got to be context specific too.
And I'm going to come back to the just transition thing. I say that's not how I want to frame it, but the just transition principle. So, how, given these are your requirements, your demands, this is what you want to push both companies and the industry to do. How would you say the response has been as you've started this particular campaign, this particular push? Are brands, and I guess, and buyers, and you maybe have to segment them. Maybe they're the biggest 200 or the biggest. So maybe you can tell us that. But what's the response to your demands? How receptive are they? How sort of do they ignore you? Do they disagree? What's the experience you've had so far?
I'm happy to go first. So I think I'll give a bit of a picture of Fashion Revolution's heritage in terms of this type of research, and then I'll talk more specifically about what fuels fashion. But to illustrate the progress that's been driven by our work, like the Global Fashion Transparency Index, which is a more comprehensive look at both human rights and environmental issues. But in terms of that work, which we started in 2017, I often point to a powerful example, which is that when we first started our transparency research in 2017, only 32 out of 100 major brands disclosed their first tier supplier lists. And by 2024, that number has grown to 52% of 250 brands, so more than quadrupling the number of brands sharing this critical information. So that's just one example of how our persistent kind of data-driven advocacy has grown the level of transparency in the industry. But of course, we don't act alone in this call for greater transparency, but I just feel like that was a good starting point to get a view of, what our collective action looks like. But in terms of the responsiveness of the industry and how we might engage with them, again, to give a view of that, 62% of 250 of the world's largest brands that are in scope of our research participated. So that involves brands reviewing their pre-filled questionnaires that my team fills out, where they can fill in any public disclosure that has been missed and respond to our queries. So this process, this collaborative process with the brand, between the brand and our team, helps the brand improve their disclosures and helps align them and sensitize them to industry best practices. So as a result, that continued engagement has shown progress year on year in terms of brands' level of transparency. And for what fuels fashion specifically, when we did, last year was the first year that we did it, but we really noticed that several participating brands significantly increased their transparency within the 6-week review period that we had given them access to the questionnaire, really kind of demonstrating their commitment to the initiative's demands. And just more broadly speaking, for the years that I've been working in this area, we've seen our influence on our influence reflected in how brands are reporting their sustainability information. So they've even adopted elements of our questionnaire and methodology structure, like sometimes even word for word. So when I'm reviewing brand sustainability reports, I can kind of see directly their response to our asks.
So that's a sign that you feel you're having an impact, and sort of significant number of big brands are listening and taking in and adapting to some of your requirements. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's too soon for me to share anything about this year's report because it's being published in several months. But like, without going into specifics, like I can see that happening again with this iteration of the report. Like, I can see brands taking our feedback, looking at the methodology, kind of disclosing in response to that. And importantly, this research often is raising ambition levels. It's going beyond what existing policy is asking of them. So I just think it's important to acknowledge that and the influence that this work has. But I don't know if Ruth you wanted to kind of add to that at all, or if there's any further questions.
Yeah, I'll just say that's totally clear. I also previously worked at Fashion Revolution, and I saw it with my own eyes. But yeah, from an Action Speaks Louder perspective, I think generally brands are keen to work, collaboratively on finding solutions, and ultimately they want to meet the standards that we and other organizations are putting out. They want, or at least some of them want to demonstrate that they're taking on board that feedback and they're demonstrating best practice. And we see that in some of our regular communications with various companies who generally are quite responsive to our campaigns. I suppose the only thing I wanted to add is that in terms of how specifically companies respond to these asks, I'd say, like, even though there's a variation in the level of, ambition or financing that's available to any given company, the general theme is that the sustainability teams of companies are quite responsive, but they can be at odds with the executives of a company. And what they really need in most cases is a really clear business case that they can push internally. And I think that's especially become clear in the economic political times we find ourselves in now. And sometimes that business case is really clear, but sometimes it requires, additional pressure, which is where organizations like ours come in. But just to say, yeah, I mean, generally the sustainability teams do really want to make progress. There are just barriers in terms of how companies are set up and the incentive structure there.
Well, Ruth, you know that's a big part of what we have talked about, and what we write about is sort of a more making the economics work, the weak business case. As I listen to you, I think how important it is from a reputational point of view if your organizations are, and you're not necessarily doing this naming and shaming, but in the case of that's one aspect of the business case for a commercial company, as I would argue. You can push back on that. Then there is, cost savings or partnerships over the long term, risk management, right? If new legislation is coming. How do you feel about, since I mentioned legislation, how do you feel about its role, and if it's sufficient, if you think EU, USA-based legislation is going to help or hinder your organization's efforts to drive this kind of change? Do you have any particular views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Liv jump in with more because Fashion Revolution do a lot of great work on policy advocacy specifically. But just to say that, yeah, I agree that the regulatory compliance is part of that business case, and where possible, where we can align with what the regulation is asking for. I mean, it's just a no-brainer for companies to prepare early. As you know, there's a lot of uncertainties at the moment with regulation in the US and the EU, but it's certainly strong legislation only helps the case for corporate accountability.
I think without getting into specifics, I suppose building off of what Ruth has shared, I think irrespective of, what is happening policy-wise, I think the role of organizations like Fashion Revolution and other civil society organizations like Action Speaks Louder is to continually raise the ambition levels and really expose the gaps, to really sensitize policymakers to those changes. I'm happy to kind of go into like kind of general asks that we have of policymakers, if that's useful.
Sure. Do you have them at hand? Yeah, just a few of
Yeah.
your asks. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're, evergreen issues, things that we always hit home, irrespective of specific legislation. But I mean, there's a lot of change that we're pushing for, and it's not just at the policy level, but there are continual stubborn issues where we see far too little movement. And I suppose I can share some examples from a human rights and environmental perspective, the things that stand out the most. So, firstly, poverty pay is a persistent crisis in the fashion industry. We know that most garment workers earn less than half of what they need to survive, including funding to send their children to school, put nutritious food on the table, live in decent housing, go to the doctor regularly, and set aside some discretionary income. So, with respect to living wages, we really need policymakers to step up and hold brands accountable for enabling those living wages. And ultimately, that can't happen without stronger protections for enabling rights like freedom of association, collective bargaining, and banning unfair purchasing practices, which I mentioned earlier in this call. So, these unfair practices are the foundation of inequality across global fashion supply chains, and they have to be dismantled. And this is an evergreen issue and something that will always put pressure on policymakers for. And in terms of an environmental perspective, we need meaningful penalties, like real financial consequences for corporate environmental harm. Nothing motivates big business more than money. Under the polluter pays principle, brands really should face liabilities if, for example, toxic dyes from their supply chains end up polluting local waterways and harming communities. So those are just kind of some examples. I've kept our asks for policymakers fairly broad, focusing on kind of the overarching demands that are evergreen issues for us rather than, the specific pieces of legislation.
Right. Fair enough. And the principle of financial penalties, and I don't know how much you talk about financial rewards for doing good work, if that's something as an evergreen issue, as you would talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, rewards and incentives are important too. I don't mean to just come hard down on, on the sticks. Like, as Ruth said, carrots and sticks are important. So we would absolutely, advocate for more of those carrot approaches too. We need lots of different levers to be kind of pulled at once and acting harmoniously.
Okay, so we're coming towards the end, and so I want you to think about things that you really want to get across to the audience about your work. I do want to link to what you just said, Liv, to the just transition principle. One of the discussions is, as you said, committing to a partnership, a supplier partnership, a company, a factory, not just leaving when the going gets tough. There seems to be a principle of that there's an investment. There are companies who say, I'm trying to reduce my emissions, and that company, that place doesn't allow me to do that. I need to move in order to reach my climate target. And then comes in the principle of, well, what do I do in that respect? And what is a just transition? You also mentioned both mitigation and adaptation. How do your organization see the actual implementation of just transition? Just briefly, I know it could be a conversation in and of itself, but is there something that you think is very clear about how a company should be applying the just transition principle?
Yeah, just to say it could definitely be a full podcast episode. Maybe that can be your next one. But yeah, I mean, interestingly, what you say about companies not getting up and leaving when the going gets tough. I mean, that's exactly why worker organizations, unions, industrial bodies have come up with responsible exit policies, which Liv knows far more about than me. But on just transition more broadly, for us, it's really about when people and their lands and livelihoods are considered while a company transitions to more sustainable practices like green energy in this case. And that, as I mentioned before, can only happen through meaningful dialogue with all the impacted groups. And most brands right now are not engaging in that as they develop their climate strategies. They're getting their science-based target approved and hoping for the best. So one thing that always comes up in our conversations with manufacturers is the financing. So brands making decarbonization demands of their suppliers, but not backing it up with any kind of financial support or incentives or future security, which is ultimately, it's an approach that's not only unfair, but it's ineffective if we actually want to make genuine progress. So in these cases, again, just repeating the same thing, but it's to consult with suppliers about the most effective approach. But more importantly, it's actually showing up to the table with the resources to make it happen.
If I may, just to build off of what Ruth has already shared, I think speaking to kind of, responsible exit, and I think just more broadly about just transition, I think, fashion brands are extremely powerful stakeholders in the supply chain, the most powerful, and it is their role, in my opinion, that they offer stability as much as possible. So, as you said, like if there's a situation in which a brand must leave their supplier, that should be the absolute last resort. And even then, there needs to be consultation on the ground, buy-in from the trade unions, like an action plan created so everyone understands what are the next steps. Again, that stability piece is so important. And for the listeners, if you want to understand more about what responsible exit looks like, I just really suggest reading up about the Responsible Contracting Project. But in terms of just transition, and just what I'll kind of wrap up saying is, what Ruth said is it's really about co-creation. It's about, incorporating stakeholder voice, ensuring that they are, listened to. And this is about gaining buy-in from workers and suppliers. I think the fear with just transition is that there's a possibility of recreating the kind of top-down colonial dynamics that have persisted for decades in the industry. So it's really important that in this crucial moment in the climate crisis, that we are genuinely listening to the needs and contextualizing action plans in response to the needs of value chain partners, including workers and suppliers.
And as we wrap up, I just want to note that from my experience, tell me if I'm wrong, you have some very big, powerful brands. And then, we work a lot with medium and smaller companies. I often think that they don't feel that they have the same kind of influence or resources to achieve what you're asking them to achieve. Is this a falsehood? Should they be considered in the same kind of hold to the same standards that sort of a large H&M or an Inditex or a Nike are being held to?
I think, to answer your question, like, the problems in this industry are, not going to be solved by any one individual. And I think for brands who feel that they don't have the power to make change, do it collectively with other brands. Like if you're sharing a supplier facility with other brands, club together your resources, be in discussion with them, like work on these things collectively if you feel that, you're not within your kind of power to make change directly on your own. So I think, there's ways in which they can work to, go further and farther if, clubbing together and acting collectively. Ruth, I don't know if you want to share further there.
Yeah, totally agree on that. And then also to say, the What Fuels Fashion work in particular only looks at the biggest brands in terms of revenue. And in terms of who we target as Action Speaks Louder, it's some of the biggest, most influential companies within their sector or within their geography. So we're certainly looking at the biggest players that have the biggest impact. But as Liv said, it's not to say that medium-sized businesses can't also really make positive change by clubbing together, but they certainly don't have the same level of responsibility as those giants.
So I think you mentioned, I don't know if I should hold you to this, but you're saying the next report comes out on what fuels fashion in September. Is that correct?
Yes, it is very much forthcoming. It will be later this year.
Later this year. Okay. Is there any other thing you want to get across as we wrap up the discussion? Anything else that your organizations want to emphasize about what you think needs to happen, what you're hoping happens in the next year, anything that we've missed?
I'm happy to go. I'd say really we're looking at accountability here, and transparency being a lever to that is like one of the most crucial backbones to any of this work in terms of corporate responsibility, whether it's legislation, whether it's individual brand policies. It's about holding those who are making the biggest impact on those with the least resources to deal with those impacts accountable. I think, which is more than fair given the size and revenue and political influence of many of these targets. The only other thing I want to say is that beyond individual brand changes, brands have a huge amount of influence on developing rules and laws. Big businesses have a huge influence again on policymakers and other standard setters. So this kind of corporate campaigning and advocacy isn't just happening in isolation. It's really deeply connected to that broader systemic policy change. And part of the role of watchdog organizations, as you call them, is to call out where that negative influence is happening on the rule setting process and, encourage and inspire positive influence, because there's a huge amount of powerful players here that could make positive change if that was turned around.
Thanks, Ruth. I suppose what I'll add is just reinforcing, the importance of the work that Fashion Revolution does with respect to transparency research. So, to make the changes we need to see in the industry, change is absolutely required on all fronts. And that's why we as a movement advocate for industry policy and cultural change. It's not an either or situation. We need many different stakeholders working collectively toward a shared goal. So I think in terms of like where we're at now, broadly speaking, every stakeholder tends to point the finger elsewhere. For example, brands say they're just responding to consumer demand. Policymakers might say that the responsibility lies with business, but this creates a constant deflection loop. There's absolutely no silver bullet. Legislation on its own does not solve everything, but it does create accountability and put pressure on brands to act. So what we really need and call for within our movement is to empower citizens to be informed and mobilize to push for the legislation that we need to help bridge the gap and translate complex issues into accessible narratives and demand accountability from brands and keep creating momentum for policy change. I think the current climate that we find ourselves in globally is extremely tough, and we need to not lose momentum for creating positive, lasting policy change. And within the environment we find ourselves in now, focusing on transparency is about exposing where voluntary action is falling short and recognizing, as Ruth said, that brands have the power to influence supply chains and lobby governments themselves. And that is something we really want to kind of further emphasize with the What Fuels Fashion work, is that brands have a role to play in advocating for policy change.
I think that is a great place to wrap up. We've talked for about 55 minutes now, so and there's so much more to go into, and maybe we can reconnect when the report for this year comes out. But with that, I want to thank you both, Liv and Ruth, for your commitment and your perspectives and analysis. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for your brilliant work, Michael.
Thank you so much. It was great to have a chat with you both.